Sean Duffy's greenlit a fast-track federal highway through a family's century-old farm. But he met his match when Jasmine Crockett used his own property rights rhetoric to corner him in a live town hall. The moment the shaky cell phone footage hit the internet, it detonated. Before the town hall in Cedar Creek, Wisconsin had even officially ended, the clip of the Texas congresswoman dismantling the Secretary of Transportation was rocketing across social media platforms with a velocity that stunned political operatives on both sides of the aisle. Hashtag #PlowedUnderPromise and hashtag DUFFYS landgrab were trending nationally within the hour. News producers scrambled to rip the video, clean up the audio, and splash it across their evening broadcasts. On cable news, hosts who had been preparing segments on inflation or foreign policy threw their rundowns in the trash. This was the story, a viral, raw, and devastatingly effective political takedown that had happened not in the curated confines of a Washington, D.C. hearing room, but in the heart of Duffy's own political turf. 40-8 hours earlier, the mood in Secretary Sean Duffy's orbit was buoyant, bordering on triumphant. He was flying back to Wisconsin, not just as a former congressman, but as a conquering hero with a cabinet title. The trip was a meticulously planned public relations tour, culminating in a town hall in the friendly territory of Marathon County. His chief of staff, a perpetually caffeinated D.C. veteran named Genevieve Reed, ran through the final checklist with him on the government jet. "The advance team has the room locked down," she said, tapping on her tablet. "Local GOP leadership will be in the front 2 rows. We've got 3 friendly questions pre-planned with community leaders. The topic is the American Heartland Infrastructure Initiative. It's a home run, Sean. You're bringing federal dollars and jobs back home." Duffy, loosening his tie, flashed the camera-ready smile that had made him a star. "First on MTV, and then in Congress. It's more than jobs, Jen. It's a message. We're rebuilding this country, and we're doing it with American muscle, not D.C. bureaucracy." He loved the sound of his own lines. He'd spent years on television honing his brand as a champion of the working man, a fighter against the swamp, and a staunch defender of individual liberties and property rights. This trip was a celebration of that brand. The centerpiece of his initiative was the new I-59 corridor, a fast-track highway designed to connect agricultural centers more directly with shipping hubs in Milwaukee. It was his signature project, a symbol of the Trump administration's promise to get things done. An internal memo had flagged some minor land acquisition issues. A dozen or so properties were in the direct path and slated for eminent domain seizure, but the legal team had assured him it was all standard procedure. One of those properties was a stubborn dairy farm outside Wasso, owned by some family that had been there for generations. The Millers, that was the name. The file noted they had refused the initial lowball offer and were now sending letters. Duffy had glanced at the summary for 30 seconds before dismissing it. It was procedural noise, the cost of doing business. "Any media prep I need to worry about?" he asked. Genevieve shook her head. "Local affiliates only. Friendly. Coverage guaranteed. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel might send a stringer, but they'll be too far back to ask anything. This is a victory lap. Smile, talk about progress, and be home in time for dinner." The overconfidence was absolute. There was zero consideration that the procedural noise could get a megaphone almost 1,000 miles away in Dallas, Texas. That megaphone was sitting in her district office, staring at a grainy video call on her laptop. Representative Jasmine Crockett listened intently, her brow furrowed. On the screen was Sarah Miller, a woman in her late 60s with worry etched into every line on her face. Beside her sat her husband, Frank, a man whose silence spoke volumes. His hands, thick and calloused from a lifetime of labor, rested on the kitchen table, looking lost without a tool or a piece of machinery to fix. Congresswoman Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. "They're taking our farm, the farm my great-grandfather built, for a road." Crockett had received the initial email from Sarah's daughter, a young lawyer in Dallas, just that morning. It was a desperate plea, one of hundreds that flooded her inbox weekly. But this one had a specific, galling detail. The name of the cabinet secretary pushing the project was Sean Duffy. Crockett knew Duffy well, not personally, but by his public persona. She'd seen him on Fox News for years, railing against government overreach, championing the little guy and wrapping himself in the Constitution. The hypocrisy was so potent it was almost a physical force. She'd asked for the video call immediately. Frank finally spoke, his voice raspy. 112 years. My family has worked this land. We survived the Depression. We survived the farm crisis of the 80s. We paid our taxes, followed the rules. Now the government just sends a letter, posts a notice on the county website, and says it's over. They offered us 30 cents on the dollar for the land. Congresswoman, 30 cents. Said it was fair market value determined by their appraisers. Sarah added, our daughter, our lawyer, she said, this is federal, a cabinet level project. It's moving too fast, she said. She said we needed someone who wasn't afraid to fight them at their level. She saw you in a hearing on C-SPAN, said, she's the one. Crockett leaned forward, her past life as a public defender snapping into focus. This wasn't about abstract policy. It was about a family being steamrolled. This was the kind of fight she had cut her teeth on, defending people who had nowhere else to turn. Send me everything, Crockett said, her voice firm, cutting through the Millers' despair. Every letter, every legal notice, the appraisal documents, the survey maps, everything. For the next several hours, Crockett and her small legislative team went to work. The documents flooded her inbox. They painted a picture of a process designed to be impenetrable for the average citizen. The Department of Transportation, under Duffy's new fast-track authority, had condensed the public comment period to a mere 15 days, announced only through a small notice in the Federal Register. The appraisal firm hired was a major D.C. contractor, Kessler and Bain, a company that had donated heavily to Duffy's past congressional campaigns and his party's national committee. The offer made to the Millers was, as Frank had said insultingly, low, valuing their prime agricultural land at the same rate as undeveloped scrubland miles away. The justification was economic necessity, a phrase so broad it was legally meaningless without specific data, which was conspicuously absent. From the documentation, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when her legislative director found the schedule for Duffy's Wisconsin trip online. He's holding a town hall, her aide said, in Marathon County, not 20 miles from the Miller farm. Day after tomorrow, Crockett looked at the screen, at the smiling, confident photo of Sean Duffy. He was going into the heart of the community. He was about to bulldoze to take a victory lap. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was arrogant, and it was a mistake. Book me a flight to Wisconsin, Crockett said, a cold, determined anger settling in her gut, and a ticket to that town hall. She wasn't a member of the Transportation Committee. She had no official jurisdiction here, but she was a member of Congress, and a citizen was about to lose everything to what she saw as a corrupt, self-serving abuse of power. That was jurisdiction enough. The battle wasn't just for the Miller family's farm. It was for the principle that the rights you championed on television had to mean something when they affected the people who couldn't fight back. She decided right then that she would step onto that battlefield and hold Sean Duffy accountable in his own backyard. The Cedar Creek High School gymnasium was packed. The air was buzzing with the energy of a local political rally. Banners with American Heartland Infrastructure Initiative and Duffy Delivers for Wisconsin hung from the basketball hoops. The first two rows were, as planned, filled with smiling local officials and business owners who stood to benefit from the construction contracts. Sean Duffy stood at a podium on a low stage, basking in the applause. He was in his element, a red, white, and blue backdrop framing him perfectly for the local news cameras. For 45 minutes, he delivered a masterclass in political charm, blending populist rhetoric with promises of prosperity. He talked about his roots in the state, the importance of hard work, and the mission he'd been given by the president. To cut through red tape and rebuild America. For too long, he boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the gym. Washington politicians have talked and talked while our roads and bridges crumbled. They were afraid to make the tough decisions. Well, we're not afraid. We're making the tough decisions to secure our economic future, to create jobs, and to make sure Wisconsin remains the backbone of this nation's economy. The applause was loud and sustained. In the 15th row, sitting between Sarah and Frank Miller, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. She wasn't there as a congresswoman. She was dressed simply, in dark pants and a plain blouse, looking like any other concerned citizen. She had listened without expression, her lawyer's mind dissecting every platitude, every carefully crafted soundbite. She felt the nervous energy radiating from the couple beside her. Frank's jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. Sarah kept twisting the strap of her purse. They were terrified. They had lived their entire lives believing in the system, and now the system was coming for them, personified by the confident man on the stage. Finally, the Q&A session began. Genevieve Reed stood off to the side, pointing to the pre-selected questioners. The first was a local hardware store owner who asked how the project would boost small businesses. The second was a union representative who asked about local hiring mandates. Duffy handled them with ease, delivering smooth, prepackaged answers. Then, a man who wasn't on the approved list managed to get to one of the microphones. It was Frank Miller. His hand holding the microphone was shaking, but his voice was firm. "Mr. Secretary," he began, "my name is Frank Miller. My family has owned Miller Dairy for 112 years, right here in this county." A ripple of recognition went through the crowd. Many of them knew Frank. They bought his milk, saw him at church, at the county fair. Duffy's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Genevieve took a half step forward, ready to intervene, but it was too late. The cameras were on Frank. "Your new highway," Frank continued, his voice cracking with emotion, "is slated to go right through our home. Right through our barn. They tell us we have to sell. They tell us the price. They say we have no choice. How is that fair? How is that the American way?" The gym grew quiet. The friendly, rally-like atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a tense silence. This was real. This wasn't a talking point. This was a man's life. Duffy held up a hand, his expression shifting to one of practiced sympathy. "Frank, I understand your concern. I truly do. Change is difficult. But this project is bigger than any one of us. It's about ensuring a prosperous future for thousands of families in this region." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And then he made his mistake. He looked down at Frank Miller, a man whose family had worked the same soil since Theodore Roosevelt was president, and delivered the line with a dismissive, almost condescending tone. "Progress requires sacrifice. Some people have to adapt for the greater good of the economy." A wave of murmurs washed over the crowd. The answer felt cold, clinical. Frank Miller stood frozen at the microphone, looking as if he'd been struck. He had no response. He had laid his heart bare, and the Secretary of Transportation had told him he was a necessary casualty for the economy. He slowly turned to walk away from the microphone, his shoulders slumped in defeat. But before he could take 2 steps, a new voice cut through the silence. It was clear, sharp, and carried an authority that made everyone, including Sean Duffy, snap their heads in its direction. "Mr. Secretary." Jasmine Crockett was now standing. She hadn't moved to the microphone. She didn't need to. Her voice, trained in courtrooms and congressional hearings, filled the space effortlessly. All cameras swiveled to her. Duffy squinted, trying to place her. He recognized the face, but couldn't immediately connect it to the setting. A Democratic congresswoman from Texas. Here, in his town hall, it didn't compute. "A question, if I may," Crockett continued, her tone polite but laced with steel. Duffy, caught off guard, and, not wanting to appear afraid of a question, gave a tight nod. "The chair recognizes the ... guest." "Thank you, Mr. Secretary," she said. "You just spoke of the greater good. And for years, on television and in the halls of Congress, I, like many Americans, have heard you speak passionately, eloquently, about the fundamental importance of property rights. You have built a brand on the idea that an individual's land, their home, is sacred, and that government overreach is a threat to our most basic liberties." She took a deliberate step into the aisle, her eyes locked on his. The entire room was now captivated. Frank and Sarah Miller watched, stunned, as this woman they had spoken to on a laptop screen just 2 days ago stood before them like a biblical avenger. "So my question is this," Crockett's voice dropped slightly, drawing everyone in. "You've spent years on television championing the rights of the individual against government overreach. Was that all just for show? Or does your greater good conveniently exempt the people whose land you want?" The question hung in the gymnasium air, sharp and heavy as a guillotine's blade. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the collective held breath of hundreds of people. The friendly smiles on the faces of the local dignitaries in the front rows froze, then began to melt into expressions of confusion and alarm. The local news cameras, which had been lazily capturing wide shots, now zoomed in tight, one on Crockett, one on Duffy, creating the split screen of a cable news producer's dreams. Sean Duffy's mind, a machine fine-tuned for media, combat whirred furiously. His first instinct was to attack the source. He saw a Democratic congresswoman, far from her Texas district, meddling in his home state triumph. It was a political ambush. He forced a chuckle, a hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, well," he said, gripping the sides of the podium. "It seems we have a guest from Washington who's flown all the way to Wisconsin to try and score some cheap political points." He gestured vaguely in her direction. "I'm not sure how they do things in Dallas, Congresswoman, but here in the heartland, we believe in progress. We believe in building things. We don't believe in letting a few disgruntled individuals stand in the way of prosperity for the entire state." It was a standard deflection, an attempt to frame her as an outsider and him as the local defender. It would have worked on television, in a controlled studio environment, but it didn't work here. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply took another step forward. "I'm not here for political points, Mr. Secretary. I'm here because the Miller family," she gestured to the stunned couple, "are my constituents' parents. And a constituent's problem doesn't have a zip code," the crowd murmured. The answer was direct, personal, and it dismantled his outsider attack in a single sentence. "You still haven't answered the question," Crockett pressed, her voice cutting through the noise. "All those years you spent talking about the sanctity of a person's home, the evils of eminent domain abuse, was that just a script, or does it only apply when it's politically convenient?" Duffy's face flushed. He was losing control. His chief of staff, Genevieve, was frantically making a cut-it-off motion from the wings, but Duffy waved her off. He wasn't going to be run off his own. "The stage? This is not abuse," he snapped, his voice a little too loud. "This is a federally authorized project under the American Heartland Infrastructure Initiative, passed by Congress and signed by the President. We are following the law to the letter." "The letter of the law," Crockett repeated, nodding slowly, as if considering it. "Let's talk about the letter of the law then, because I'm a lawyer. Are you aware, Mr. Secretary, that the public comment period for this fast-track project was limited to just 15 days? Duffy stared at her blankly. Of course, he wasn't aware of that specific detail. That was for the underlings. "And are you aware," Crockett continued, her voice rising in tempo, "that the only notice was a single posting in the Federal Register, a document I'm sure every farmer in Marathon County reads with their morning coffee?" A few people in the crowd chuckled grimly. "Are you aware that the appraisal of the Millers' farm, their home, their legacy, was conducted by Kestler and Bain?" She let the name hang in the air for a moment. A D.C.-based firm that, according to FEC filings, has donated over $200,000 to your political campaigns and affiliated PACs over the last decade. Is that the letter of the law you're referring to? A rushed process, hidden from the public, with appraisals handled by your political donors? Each question was a body blow. Duffy was reeling. He had no answers for this. These were details, facts. He dealt in broad strokes, in visions, in stimates. He was a television host in a cabinet secretary's suit, and he had just been dragged into a courtroom deposition he never prepared for. That's an outrageous accusation," he stammered, pointing a finger at her. "You're coming in here, and ... and you're slandering decorated professionals and impugning the integrity of my department." "It's not slander if it's true, Mr. Secretary." Crockett shot back instantly. The public defender in her was alive, electric. The FEC filings are public record. The Federal Register noticeor, lack thereof's, public record. The timeline is public record. These aren't my facts. They are your department's facts. So let's talk about integrity. Is it integrity to offer a family 30 cents on the dollar for land their family has bled for based on a report from a friendly donor? Is that the sacrifice you believe they should make for the greater good? The phrase greater good was now poison in the room. She had turned his own words into a weapon and was now using it against him with surgical precision. A man in the back of the gym, wearing a John Deere hat, shouted, "Tell him, lady." Another woman near the front yelled, "We're not your sacrifice, Duffy." The dam of polite deference had broken. The room was turning on him. Duffy's composure finally shattered. The charming television personality vanished, replaced by a red-faced, angry politician. "You know what this is," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "This is radical, progressive obstructionism. You and your party want to see America fail. You want to block every project, kill every job, just to undermine the president. You don't care about the Millers. You're just using this family, this decent family, as pawns in your disgusting political game." It was a fatal error. In his anger, he had made it personal, partisan, and, worst of all, he had once again dismissed the legitimacy of the Millers, plight, framing them as fools being manipulated by a political mastermind. Jasmine Crockett stood silent for a moment, letting his tirade echo in the gym. She let the crowd absorb his fury. She let them see the panic behind his eyes. Then she looked at Frank and Sarah Miller. Frank was now standing, his hand on his wife's shoulder, his expression no longer one of defeat, but of dawning hope. Crockett's voice, when she spoke again, was quiet, devoid of anger, filled with a profound and sorrowful gravity that commanded absolute silence. "Look at them, Mr. Secretary," she said softly. "Please, just look at them. Do they look like political pawns? To you? These are not radicals, sir," Crockett continued. "They are grandparents. They are the people your party claims to represent every single election cycle. The quiet, hard-working, patriotic Americans who follow the rules and love their country. And your progress is about to make them homeless. Your greater good is about to erase a century of their family's history from the face of the earth. So I will ask you one last time, and I want you to look at Mr. and Mrs. Miller when you answer. Forget about me. Forget about politics. Look at them and tell them, why is your highway more important than their home? The gymnasium was a tomb. There was no answer. There was nothing Duffy could say. Any response would be a confession of either impotence or monstrous indifference. He was utterly, completely defeated. He stood at the podium, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He had walked into his own coronation and had been politically executed in front of his entire kingdom. Genevieve Reed finally saw her opening. She and 2 aides rushed onto the stage. "That's all the time we have," she announced loudly into the microphone, her voice strained. "The secretary has another event. Thank you all for coming." They physically surrounded Duffy, turning him away from the crowd and ushering him towards the exit behind the stage. He didn't look back. He didn't wave. He was simply herded out of the gym, like a man being escorted from a crime scene. The town hall was over. The moment Duffy was gone, the room erupted. A wave of people surged forward, not towards the empty stage, but towards the woman in the 15th row. Jasmine Crockett was immediately enveloped. Frank Miller grabbed her hand, his own rough hand, trembling. "Thank you," he choked out, tears welling in his eyes. "God bless you. Thank you." Sarah Miller hugged her, sobbing openly. "You gave us a voice," she whispered. "We had no voice." Other people pressed in. Farmers, small business owners, teachers, all patting her on the shoulder, shaking her hand, thanking her. "I got a notice about my well water from that project," one man said. "They told me to shut up about it. They want to put a service road through my backyard," another woman added. "I've been calling his office for weeks, and no one would call me back." They weren't just the disaffected. They were the ignored, the dismissed, the people who had been designated as acceptable losses for progress. In that moment, Crockett wasn't a Texas Democrat to them. She was their lawyer. She was their champion. The local news reporters who had initially treated the event like a routine assignment now swarmed her, microphones and phones thrust in her face. "Congresswoman, what will be your next step? Congresswoman, are you calling for the secretary's resignation? Will you be filing a formal ethics complaint?" She held up a hand, calming the chaos slightly. She pulled the Millers close, one arm around Sarah. "Tonight," she said, her voice steady and clear, speaking to the cameras but looking at the people around her. Tonight was about making sure the Miller family was heard. The next step is to make sure they are not forgotten. The secretary can run from a town hall, but he cannot run from his duty. This fight is not over. The shaky cell phone video was the spark, but the professional footage from the local news affiliate was the accelerant. By the time Jasmine Crockett arrived back, At the nondescript Marriott Courtyard in Wausau, the firestorm was already raging out of control. The clip, now packaged and branded by every major news network, was the single most dominant story in the country. It led the homepages of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. It was played on a loop on CNN, MSNBC, and, most tellingly, on Fox News, where pundits struggled to defend Duffy while simultaneously critiquing his disastrous performance. The hashtags #plowed under promise and #DUFFYS landgrab were no longer just trending. They had become cultural shorthand for government hypocrisy. Memes were already proliferating. Duffy's enraged face next to his old smiling TV persona with the caption "How it started" versus "How it's going." A map of Wisconsin with a new highway detour drawn directly around the Miller farm. The velocity of the digital reaction was breathtaking. It was a perfect political story for the modern age. A clear hero, a clear villain, a moment of dramatic confrontation, and a deeply sympathetic victim. The official response from the Department of Transportation, when it came, was a masterclass in pouring gasoline on a fire. Around midnight, Genevieve Reed issued a formal press release. It was defensive, aggressive, and completely tone-deaf. It didn't mention the Millers by name, referring only to necessary land acquisitions vital for national economic security. It accused Representative Crockett of orchestrating a premeditated and partisan political stunt, and of willfully misrepresenting a standard federal infrastructure process to incite public anger. The statement ended by defiantly proclaiming that the I-59 corridor project was of paramount importance and would proceed as planned. The internet reacted with fresh derision. The press release was screen-grabbed and annotated by legal experts, journalists, and activists, who pointed out that it failed to address any of the specific fact-based allegations Crockett had made regarding the appraisal firm or the public notice period. It was the response of an entrenched bureaucracy that had been caught and simply could not believe. It had to answer to the public. It reeked of arrogance, and in doing so, it only proved Crockett's point. In her hotel room, Crockett had kicked off her shoes and was sitting on the edge of the bed, the television muted. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins in the gymnasium had long since dissipated, leaving a profound, humming exhaustion in its wake. Her cell phone, which she'd placed on the nightstand, buzzed and vibrated so incessantly it looked like it was having a seizure. It was a relentless cascade of calls and texts from her chief of staff, David Chen. From the House Democratic leadership, from caucus chairs, from fellow members of Congress, from newsbookers at every show imaginable. She ignored it all, for a moment letting the silence of the room be her only companion. She replayed the confrontation in her mind, not with triumph, but with the critical eye of a lawyer reviewing a case. Did she press too hard? Did she miss anything? Was her anger visible? She had walked in with a clear strategy, used Duffy's own words, his own brand, against him. Stick to the facts of the Miller's case, and force him to answer a simple, human question. It had worked. It had worked better than she could have possibly imagined, and that was the terrifying part. The sheer scale of the reaction was a force of nature she had unleashed but did not fully control. Finally, she picked up the phone and called David, who answered on the first ring. "Jasmine, are you okay? I've been trying to reach you for 2 hours." His voice was a mixture of awe and panic. "I'm fine, David. Just ... processing. Jas, the world is exploding. The DNC wants to issue a statement. The Progressive Caucus wants to hold a rally. Jake Tapper, Rachel Maddow, and get this Brett, Byers' producers, have all called. They all want you, exclusively." The White House. Press secretary was asked about it in the late briefing and fumbled it completely. "This is seismic," Crockett sighed, rubbing her temples. "What's the chatter from the other side?" There was a brief pause on the line. "It's ugly," David said, his voice lowering. "You need to be prepared. We're getting flooded. The official email inbox is a toxic waste dump. Your social media mentions are a horror show. The usual stuff, but amplified by 1,000. Crockett knew what the usual stuff meant. It was the vile lexicon of hate that any woman, particularly a black woman, in public life was forced to endure. It was racist, misogynistic, and graphic. "How bad?" she asked, her voice flat. David hesitated. "Bad enough that I've already looped. In the sergeant at arms. They're coordinating with Capitol Police. They're recommending security for you in Wisconsin and on your flight back to D.C. Crockett closed her eyes. This was the mandatory tax on success, the price of speaking truth to power. For every message of support, there was a message promising violence. For every person who saw her as a hero, there was another who saw her as a target. They're posting pictures of your D.C. apartment building on 8chan, David continued quietly. They're trying to find your family's address in Texas. This isn't just online trolls, Jazz. This is coordinated. The exhaustion she felt deepened into something heavier. A cold, weary anger. It was the cost. The private, hidden cost behind the viral clips and the triumphant headlines. It was the knowledge that doing her job, standing up for a family like the Millers, would inevitably put her own family at risk. Her personal cell phone, the one with a number only a handful of people had, began to ring. The screen read Mom. She took a deep breath and answered, forcing a lightness into her voice she did not feel. "Hey Mama, Jasmine Felicia Crockett. Don't you hey Mama me?" Her mother's voice was sharp with worry. "I saw it on the news. I saw that man's face. He looked like he hated you. Are you safe?" Crockett sank back onto the hotel bed's pillows. "I'm safe, Mama. I'm fine. Just a long day." "Baby, the whole world is talking about you. Your aunties are all calling me. My pastor called me. But all I can see is the look in that man's eyes. You made a powerful enemy today, Jasmine. A very powerful enemy. You have to be careful." "I'm always careful, Mama." "No, you're not," her mother retorted, the fear softening her voice. "You're brave, and brave people aren't always careful. I'm proud of you. You know that, what you did for that family. It was righteous. But I'm your mother, and I'm scared. I need to know you have people with you. You are not alone in that." "Hotel room, are you?" The question hung in the air. In that moment, she had never felt more alone. She was in a generic hotel room, hundreds of miles from home, with the entire political world screaming her name, and the only thing she wanted was to be in her mother's kitchen. "I'm not alone," she lied. "The team is here. David is handling everything. We're fine." She spent another 10 minutes reassuring her mother, promising to call again the moment she woke up. When she hung up, the weight of the lie and the truth of her mother's fear settled upon her. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet, sleeping town of Wausau, Wisconsin. The lights of the city seemed a world away from the storm she was in. The viral firestorm, the political maneuvering, the threats, the worry, it was all-consuming. She could let it consume her. She could retreat, issue a polite statement, let the party infrastructure handle the fallout, and try to ride out the wave. That was the safe play. That was the path of a politician. But the face that kept appearing in her mind wasn't Sean Duffy's. It was Frank Miller's, the look of utter soul-crushing defeat on his face when Duffy had dismissed him, and then the look of dawning, unbelievable hope when she had stood up to speak. She had made a promise in that gym. This fight is not over. She owed it to the Millers, and to every other person who had ever been told they were a necessary sacrifice to see it through. The fear was real. The exhaustion was real. But the resolve hardening in her chest was real too. She picked up her phone and called David. "Back, David," she said, her voice now clear and decisive. "Get me the producer for Jake Tapper. Tell them I'll be on their show tomorrow night exclusively, and get me a conference room for the morning. I'm holding a press conference here in Wisconsin with the Miller family. Sean Duffy wants to talk about the American heartland. Fine, tomorrow we're going to show the whole country what that really means." She was done reacting. It was time to command the narrative. The morning after the town hall, millions of Americans driving to work were listening to Jedediah Jed Stone. His syndicated radio show, The Founder's Anvil, was a pillar of conservative media. A 3-hour sermon on constitutional originalism, fiscal discipline, and the evils of big government. His audience was fiercely loyal, and his endorsement could make or break a Republican primary candidate. That morning, they tuned in expecting the usual condemnation of the radical left. And for the first few minutes, Jed delivered. He spoke of a nation losing its way, succumbing to socialist ideologies. Then he pivoted so sharply it gave his listeners whiplash. And then Jed's gravelly voice crackled through the speakers. "Then you see a glimmer of something, a flash of the old spirit. You see a principle defended so fiercely, so righteously, that you have to stand up and applaud, no matter who is doing the defending. And folks, I'm telling you, what I saw yesterday out of a high school gym in Wisconsin, ... It gave me that glimmer of hope. He paused for effect. Now, the person doing the defending is a Democratic congresswoman from Texas. Her voting record, from my perspective, is a train wreck. I likely disagree with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on 99 out of 100 issues, but on that one issue, ... on that one principle. She was not a Democrat or a Republican. She was an American, and she was right. He played the entire unedited audio of the exchange between Crockett and Duffy. The silence in the gym, Frank Miller's trembling voice, Duffy's condescending dismissal, and then Crockett's methodical legal demolition. When the clip ended, Jed was audibly furious. That, my friends, is the sound of the swamp. That is the sound of a man who spent years on my television network, on all our networks, selling you a bill of goods about property rights and the Constitution, and then the moment he gets a little bit of power, he wields it like a Roman emperor against his own people. Progress requires sacrifice. Spoken like a true statist, spoken like the very swamp creatures he swore to fight. The Fifth Amendment doesn't say, nor shall private property be taken for public use, unless a cabinet secretary thinks it's for the greater good, it says, without just compensation. And it implies a process that is fair and transparent, not some backroom deal cooked up with your political donors. For the next 20 minutes, Jed Stone, the kingmaker of the right, eviscerated a Republican Secretary of Transportation. He wasn't defending Crockett's party. He was defending a principle he held sacred. He accused Duffy of ideological treason, of becoming the very thing he pretended to hate. I don't care if this highway is paved with gold and creates 1 million jobs, he thundered. If you have to destroy one innocent family's home, one family's legacy, through deceit and coercion to build it, then it is a road to tyranny. Secretary Duffy, you owe the Miller family an apology. You owe the people of Wisconsin an apology. And you owe the conservatives you duped for years an apology. And Congresswoman Crockett, well, Congresswoman ... damn fine job. The monologue was a political earthquake. It shattered the partisan frame that Duffy's team was desperately trying to build. Suddenly, this wasn't a Democrat attacking a Republican story anymore. It was a story about government overreach, a core conservative issue. Phones lit up on Capitol Hill. Republican lawmakers who were preparing to go on TV to defend Duffy were abruptly pulled by their staff. Duffy's office, which had been tracking the online vitriol aimed at Crockett with satisfaction, was now in a full-blown panic. They were being savaged, not by MSNBC, but from deep within their own ideological territory. Jed Stone had given their base permission to side with Jasmine Crockett. The press conference was held in a small, rented conference room at a Wausau hotel. The space was packed wall-to-wall with local and national media. There was no fancy podium, no American Heartland banners. There was just a simple table. At the center sat Jasmine Crockett. To her right were Frank and Sarah Miller. To her left were 2 other local couples who had also received eminent domain notices. The visual was devastatingly powerful. The Washington lawyer flanked not by politicians, but by the ordinary people at the heart of the fight. Crockett began, her voice calm and measured. She did not gloat about her victory the night before. She didn't even mention Sean Duffy's name at first. Instead, she talked about the Constitution. Yesterday, in this county, a fundamental American promise was broken, she began. It's a promise that's older than any political party. It's the promise that your home is your castle, that the government is not your master, but your servant, and that the rights enshrined in our Constitution are not suggestions, they are guarantees. She looked directly into the main network camera. This is not a Democratic or Republican issue. The right to own property, to build a life, to pass on your legacy to your children without fear that it will be capriciously seized by a powerful bureaucracy is an American value. It is the value that unites the farmer in Wisconsin, the rancher in Texas, the small business owner in California, and the homeowner in Florida. She had built the bridge. Now she walked across it. The Fifth Amendment is clear, she continued, her voice gaining strength, becoming the prosecutor in the courtroom. It says, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." That phrase, just compensation, is not meant to be determined by a politically connected appraisal firm in a backroom deal. It is meant to be the result of a fair, open, and transparent process, a process that was denied to the Miller family and so many others. She laid out the facts again, calmly, clinically. The 15-day comment period, the lack of public notice, the conflict of interest with the appraisal firm. She wasn't shouting, she was teaching. She was making an argument so clear, so rooted in shared values, that to oppose it was to oppose the principle itself. Therefore, she said, reaching the climax of her statement, "We are not here today to ask. We are here to demand. First, an immediate and total halt to all eminent domain proceedings related to the I-59 project until a full independent audit can be conducted. Second, that this audit be performed not by a D.C. contractor, but by a panel of Wisconsin-based land use experts with no ties to this administration. Third, a new public comment period of no less than 90 days announced in every local paper and on every local news station in the affected counties. And fourth, a public hearing chaired by a bipartisan congressional committee, where Secretary Duffy will have to answer questions not from me, but from the families whose lives he is attempting to upend." She then turned the microphone over to Frank Miller. The man who had stood, defeated, in the gymnasium 24 hours earlier, was gone. In his place was a citizen who had found his voice. He stood up, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder. "My name is Frank Miller," he said, his voice steady. "I am not a statistic. I am not an anomaly. I am not a necessary sacrifice. I am an American citizen. And this is my home." He looked at the cameras, his eyes burning with a righteous anger. Mr. Duffy said he was following the law. Well, we are the law, the people, and we are telling him, "You have gone too far. We will not be plowed under." The press conference was a stunning success. It cemented Crockett's position as the principled leader of the fight and further isolated Duffy. The images of the stoic, determined Miller family standing up for their rights were everywhere. Later that afternoon, the news broke. The Department of Transportation, which had been silent all day, canceled a planned groundbreaking ceremony for the I-59 project in Milwaukee. The official reason given was scheduling conflicts. Everyone knew the truth. They were in full retreat. The momentum had not just shifted, it had reversed, creating a political tidal wave. All eyes now turned to Washington and to the primetime interview Crockett was scheduled to give that evening. She had won the battle in the town hall and the war for public opinion. Now, she had the opportunity to stand on the national stage, on her own terms, and deliver the final, defining argument. The harsh, bright lights of the CNN studio in Washington, D.C. felt a universe away from the humble hotel conference room in Wausau. Jasmine Crockett sat opposite Jake Tapper, a resolute desk-themed backdrop behind them. She was composed, focused. The whirlwind of the last 72 hours had been a trial by fire, but it had forged her resolve into something harder than steel. She knew this interview was the final battlefield. It was her chance to define the entire affair, not just for the news cycle, but for the political record. "Congresswoman Crockett, welcome," Tapper began, his tone serious. "You have, to put it mildly, had quite a week. You've accused a sitting cabinet secretary of cronyism and abuse of power. His department claims you orchestrated a political stunt. What do you say to Americans who see this as just another partisan food fight?" Crockett met his gaze without blinking. "I'd say they should talk to Frank and Sarah Miller," she replied calmly. "This isn't about a party, it's about a principle. When a family is told their home and their history are worthless in the face of government power, that's not a partisan issue. That's an American issue. When an appraisal for that home is handled by a firm that happens to be a major political donor to the man in charge, that's not a political stunt. That's a legitimate question that deserves a legitimate answer," Tapper pressed, playing devil's advocate. But Secretary Duffy's supporters would argue that progress does, in fact, require sacrifice. This highway, the I-59 corridor, is projected to create thousands of jobs and be a significant economic boon to a part of the country that needs it. Are you against that progress? Are you willing to sacrifice the prosperity of many for the property of a few? It was the exact argument Duffy had failed to make effectively, and Crockett was ready for it. "That is a false choice, Jake, And it's the most dangerous kind of argument a government can make. It's the argument that a citizen's constitutional rights are negotiable. The moment we accept that one family's rights can be sacrificed for the greater good, we've made every family's rights vulnerable. True progress, lasting progress, doesn't come from bulldozing the rights of the people. It comes from respecting them. There are a dozen other potential routes for this highway that don't involve destroying a century-old farm. The question isn't progress versus property. The question is why the Department of Transportation chose the one route that benefited a politically connected family over the route that respected the rights of a powerless one. She was referencing a detail her team had uncovered overnight. The proposed route had been subtly altered from its original plan to avoid the property of a wealthy local businessman who was a major state GOP donor. She didn't have to elaborate. The seed was planted. The interview continued for 10 more minutes. Crockett never raised her voice. She was forensic, calm, and relentless. She turned every question about politics back to the principles of the Constitution and the facts of the Miller case. When Tapper asked if she believed Secretary Duffy should resign, she deftly sidestepped the political trap. A resignation would be easy, she said. It would allow everyone to move on and forget how this happened. I'm not interested in one man's career. I'm interested in systemic reform. This isn't just about Secretary Duffy. It's about a federal eminent domain process that is tilted in favor of the powerful and against the average citizen. What I'm calling for is a new piece of legislation, the Property Rights and Transparency Act, that would mandate independent appraisals, triple the public comment period for federal projects, and create a citizens advocate office within the DOT. The goal isn't to get a political scalp. The goal is to make sure that what happened to the Miller family never happens to any other family again. It was a brilliant move. She had elevated the entire conflict from a personal spat to a serious policy debate. She wasn't just a fighter. She was a legislator. She had defined the lasting purpose of her battle. When the interview concluded, the political world knew it was over. Duffy was finished. In the month that followed, the consequences cascaded exactly as Crockett had willed them, under bipartisan pressure, fueled by the relentless drumming of commentators like Jedstone and the powerful moral clarity of Crockett's campaign. The Department of Transportation officially announced an indefinite pause on the I-59 corridor project. The press release was a study in bureaucratic capitulation, filled with jargon about reevaluating community impact and engaging in a broader listening tour. It was a complete and total surrender. Sean Duffy became a ghost in the administration. He was no longer booked for Sunday shows. His signature project was a toxic asset. He was a living caricature of the swamp, and his political capital was gone. 2 weeks after the town hall, a certified letter arrived at the Miller farm. Sarah Miller opened it with trembling hands while Frank watched from the kitchen doorway. It was from the U.S. Department of Transportation. It was a single page. It stated that the eminent domain action against their property, parcel number 7B for 22A, was formally rescinded pending the results of a full programmatic review. Sarah read it twice, then a third time before the tears came. They were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. Frank walked over and put his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder. They stood there, in their kitchen, in the home there the family had inhabited for over a century, and wept. They had won. Their home was safe. The lasting echo of that victory, however, was heard nearly 1,000 miles away. In a small, bustling neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina, Alina Ramirez was wiping down the counter of the small restaurant she had built from nothing. Sabor de mi tierra was her dream, a culmination of 15 years of working 2 jobs, saving every penny, and perfecting her mother's recipes. But her dream was being threatened. A massive new city-led redevelopment project, anchored by a luxury condominium complex, was slated to be built on her block. The developer, a powerful firm with deep ties to the mayor's office, had made all the small business owners on the street lowball offers. Under eminent domain was a done deal. Most had already given up, convinced they couldn't fight City Hall. Alina was about to be one of them. She felt powerless, invisible, another necessary sacrifice for someone else's idea of progress. One evening, scrolling through her phone when she saw a clip her cousin had shared, it was a fiery woman in a town hall talking about property rights. It was Jasmine Crockett. Alina stopped and watched. She saw the fear in Sarah Miller's eyes and recognized it as her own. She heard the cold, dismissive words of the man on the stage and recognized the tone of the developer who had patronized her in her own restaurant. Then she heard Crockett's voice cutting through the noise, armed with facts and fury. She spent the next hour watching everything she could find: the full town hall, the press conference with the Millers, the interview with Jake Tapper. "The powerless," she heard Frank Miller say. "I am not a statistic. I am an American citizen." Something inside Alina, something that had been dormant and afraid, clicked into place. The next morning, she didn't call the developer to accept their offer. Instead, she picked up the phone and called the Institute for Justice, a nonprofit law firm that specialized in property rights cases. Then she walked next door to the tailor shop and the shoe repair store and the bakery. She told them what she had seen. She told them about the Millers. She told them they didn't have to be victims. She told them that they too were citizens and that their fight was just beginning. The echo of a battle won in a Wisconsin gymnasium had become the first drumbeat of a new one in North Carolina. What does it truly mean for a government to be of the people, by the people, for the people, of many? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. For more stories that go behind the headlines, don't forget to like and subscribe.